Hi everyone, welcome to the first lecture in Module 3. Today we are going to be talking about the food revolution, focusing on the development of agriculture, particularly in the Middle East. So let's get into it. So I want to start today's class on the development of agriculture with a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a 19th century Enlightenment thinker who wrote about virtues and morality. In the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, Rousseau wrote that from the moment it appeared an advantage for one man to possess enough provisions for two, equality vanished, property was introduced, and labor became necessary. Rousseau's main argument was that human beings are basically good by nature, but were corrupted by the complex historical events that resulted in present-day civil society. Rousseau particularly attributes the downfall of humanity to the origins of surplus. Basically, once humans were able to preserve and store more than they actually needed to survive on a daily basis, things started going downhill. Formal storage pits appear in the archaeological record about 10,000 years ago, and these are the best archaeological indicators that we have for this beginning of surplus accumulation. In general, 10,000 years ago is pretty late in the human history of evolution when we think about the huge amounts of time that we've already talked about so far in modules 1 and 2. Storage pits are seen as the first material markers of what's called a delayed return economy, rather than an immediate return economy. So what's the difference here? The difference between an immediate and delayed return economy is based on an equation that compares labor investment to time before consumption. For hunter-gatherer societies, we consider them to have what's called an immediate return economy. So basically the idea here is that hunter-gatherers receive a direct and immediate return for their labor. When you go out on a hunt, you are either successful or you aren't, and you know it pretty quickly. In this sort of immediate return economy, you value consumption over accumulation. In contrast, most agricultural, herding, or capitalist societies like we have today are based on a delayed return economy. In this context, work is really invested at a kind of large scale and over extended periods of time. And there's a significant gap between the original time invested in, let's say, planting fields and the time that it takes for the crops to actually develop and become ready for harvest and then consumption. In order to distribute labor needed to plant all these crops over time and then to redistribute the results of these agricultural yields, hierarchical structures of authority began to develop. These hierarchical social relationships created economic inequality. So, what were the conditions that led at least most of our ancestors to adopt this delayed return economy and all sorts of associated forms of social hierarchy? Well, around 12,000 years before present, essentially modern climatic conditions prevailed. We see warmer temperatures, increased seasonality, and reduced year-to-year variability. All of these kind of environmental conditions created a kind of opportune moment for resource diversification. In association with this advantageous climate, we see what archaeologist Louis Binford has called a broad spectrum revolution. This revolution is associated with the major diversification of diet, which we see in Homo sapiens at the end of the Paleolithic. So remember, thinking back to our lecture 2.3, where we talked about Paleolithic art, which generally falls between 12,000 and 8,000 years before present. So there's two kind of traditional models which have been used to explain why humans developed agriculture: an environmental model and a social model. Environmental theorists argue that ecological factors, such as local variability in food resources or climate, led to the development of agriculture. According to this perspective, some resources, for example wheat, were seen as highly desirable. As people used these resources more and more, they eventually became domesticated. Environmental models have really dominated archaeological explanations for the development of agriculture since the 1930s. But they hit their heyday in the 1960s, where we see a particular understanding about how humans adapted to their social and physical environments emerge within archaeological scholarship. This particular approach is called cultural ecology. Cultural ecology theories focused on ecological factors such as local variability in food resources and the interactive effects of human exploitation. These theorists developed multivariate models which took into account the reality that many early Holocene hunter-gatherer societies were more complex and were adapted to food production before anyone started planting grain or penning animals. One key figure in the development of a cultural ecology explanation for the development of agriculture was a professor named Kent Flannery at the University of Michigan. Kent Flannery used this cultural ecology approach to examine how and why Mesoamericans took up agriculture. Flannery's argument about the development of agriculture stemmed from this basic premise: one, that farming is actually less efficient than foraging, and two, that humans must have been forced to develop agriculture because it is less efficient and therefore wouldn't have been a natural evolutionary choice. So Flannery proposed that population growth was the primary driver which forced Mesoamericans to develop agriculture. According to Flannery, the world at the end of the Pleistocene, think about 11,000 years ago, was characterized by limited and patchy resources. The limited and patchy resources put a strain on subsistence. During this period of increased subsistence strain, people started to use a greater variety of wild foods. This is what Binford was talking about in terms of the broad spectrum diet. Instead of continuing to move as a way to minimize risk and food shortages, hunter-gatherers developed new grinding tools and storage pits to more efficiently capture and store calories in these kind of fixed locations, usually in river valleys. These adaptation strategies proved successful and populations began to grow. And this process continued, with people developing more and more strategies for maximizing and preserving a diversity of food resources in these kind of scarce, patchy environments, leading to population growth, leading to new developments to make subsistence practices more efficient. So population growth in these kind of restricted river valleys with diverse resources can cause food shortages. Because there is less mobility and everyone has less territory to move around in. At a certain point, hunter-gatherer populations exceeded the local carrying capacity of these river valleys, creating the conditions for adaptation. Eventually, some groups are forced to move out of this optimal river valley zone and into marginal areas. And when they make that move, they attempt to recreate their former foraging habitat by bringing plants into these new ecological niches, changing the natural selection regime of the environments they're moving into. These migrant populations were subject to what has been called Roemer's Rule. This is a rule named after American paleontologist Alfred Roemer. According to Roemer, the effect of many important evolutionary changes is actually to enable organisms to continue in the same way of life, rather than adapt to a new one. So if we apply Roemer's rule to humans, then it's possible that agriculture was first developed by those small groups who had been forced into new environments by population growth and the constraints, the actual carrying capacity constraints of these riverine valleys. But instead of recreating their whole subsistence strategies, these migrants wished to maintain the same lifestyle they had while living in the resource-rich areas. And so they brought in new plants, creating the first signs of domestication. So while the environment was certainly a major factor in influencing the development of agriculture, the cultural ecology approach has also been criticized for emphasizing environmental change at the expense of social change. During the 1980s, archaeologists shifted their focus towards the role of human beings in the development of agriculture. For example, Canadian archaeologist Brian Hayden has argued that competition within complex hunter-gatherer societies was actually one of the primary drivers leading to the development of agriculture. According to Hayden, basically you have ambitious individuals who acquire prestige and social standing by throwing feasts. These feasts create obligations to the attendees that they are unable to match. Hayden then argues that many of the first cultivated plants that we see, things like chili peppers, were actually flavorings rather than staple foods. The fact that we see so many flavoring type foods being developed early on suggests that cultivation was first adopted to provide supplies of especially prized forms of food and drink, linked to gaining political and economic power through gift giving. Okay, so we have two models: environmental, which emphasizes the role of nature and the environment in the development of agriculture, and then social models, which emphasize the role of culture and human actors. The kind of narrative of how we developed agriculture as a human species is actually a little more complicated than any one of these explanations, and is typically believed to be both a mixture of human responses to environmental constraints, as well as human initiatives linked to social and cultural belief systems. So where did agriculture first develop? Food production began at different times in various parts of the world, but the earliest evidence for the manipulation of plants comes from Southwest Asia, or what has been called the Fertile Crescent. So in the Fertile Crescent, during this time period, we have a pretty variable climate at the end of the Pleistocene. We have peak wet conditions happening about 11,000 years ago. And with these peak wet conditions, we see the proliferation of large grains throughout this area, throughout the Fertile Crescent, as well as Anatolia, things like barley, emmer, and wheat, which later become domesticated. Also during this time, there's large grazing animals moving around the Southwest Asia. Animals like goats and oxen, which also later become domesticates. So this period in human history is referred to archaeologists as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, which stretches from roughly 9600 to 8500 BC, so before Christ or before present. Neolithic here in this term, pre-pottery Neolithic, refers to the development of agriculture in particular. The site of Jericho offers some of the best evidence for human social life during this period. The early residents of Jericho were not yet making pottery, but they did make vessels out of stone. They wove cloth and were trading for desirable stone sources as far away as eastern Turkey. In contrast to other Neolithic villages, which only covered a few acres, the site of Jericho extended over 9.8 acres and was built on this giant mound, which you can see behind me. Underneath, within the city, you see this kind of beehive-shaped huts that were tightly clustered all together. Jericho is widely considered the oldest continuously inhabited city in the entire world. Jericho also provides us with evidence for cultivated types of particularly wheat and barley. It also provides us with some archaeological evidence of communal architecture. So let's zoom in here. What we see underneath this mound in Jericho are stone walls constructed around the entire settlement, nearly 6 feet thick and standing 12 feet high. As part of these walls, there was a massive tower 30 feet in diameter and standing 27 feet high, with an interior staircase winding down. The pit of this tower was filled with bodies. Around the tower, we see a border of a rock-cut ditch, almost 9 feet deep. The communal labor needed to construct these walls and towers would have required extensive political and economic cooperation, as well as extensive amounts of resources at a kind of unprecedented scale. It's unclear why the residents of Jericho needed these seemingly large-scale defensive walls, but it may have been because of intergroup competition for scarce resources. Some geomorphological research hints that these walls may have also been used as flood control works. Around about 7000 BC, there's evidence at Jericho for the development of a religious cult. Archaeologists discovered a large building dating to this time with a unique series of plastered interior pits and basins, as well as a domed adjoining structure believed to be for ceremonial use. Other evidence of cult practices were discovered in several homes in the form of plastered human skulls, molded to resemble living heads. You can see one behind me in the screen. Shells were inlaid and used to depict eyes in a realistic fashion. And traces of paint were revealed that skin and hair were also included in these representations. So we have very lifelike representations of humans. 9 of these skulls were found buried under the floor of just one house. This evidence suggests the presence of a new desire at Jericho to establish ancestral claims to property. One other example of a pre-Pottery Neolithic site with evidence of Semitism, domestication, and ceremonial cults is the Jerf el Amar site, located in northern Syria. This site dates to about 11,600 years ago and contained 40 well-preserved houses, 3 of which were had large subterranean structures like what you see depicted behind me. These structures were 9 meters in diameter and 2 meters deep, and probably served as both storehouses for grain and as ceremonial community centers. Archaeologists also found small terracotta plaquettes decorated with mnemonic symbols, suggesting that at Al Jafar we have the first evidence of kind of early writing system emerging in direct association with a record keeping associated with surplus. At Jebel Amar, we also begin seeing a delayed return economy and what Rousseau saw as the downfall of modern man. Remember, Rousseau said, "Beware the humble storage pit," or in this case, the granary, because it is with the humble storage pit that we first see the rise of social inequality. And it would seem that Rousseau was right in being so wary of storage pits. Let's zoom in. At the end of its use life, it appears that several of these storage pits at Jerf el Amar contained headless corpses placed at the center of the floor. This suggests that we have early signs of ritualized abandonment in which individuals were sacrificed, placed at the bottom of the granary before the granary was closed up. So in conclusion, the evidence then of new forms of group ceremonialism that we see at sites in the Fertile Crescent are directly linked and directly in response to the development of agriculture, the rise of more densely clustered cities, and the evolution of hierarchical systems in which certain individuals were in control over the redistribution of surplus.